Hello, everyone. This week we are talking about sexual violence. And before we get started, I just want to say that sexual violence is an incredibly difficult topic that personally impacts far too many people in this world. And if this is something for you that is not physically or emotionally safe for you to talk about in an academic setting, please let me know so that I can provide you with some alternate assignments and readings for the week because I want all of us to be safe and healthy as possible. And so if this is not going to be something that is safe for you, please let me know. But I do want to make the distinction at the same time of really knowing that this is probably going to be unpleasant or uncomfortable for folks to talk about, and that is not the same thing as being physically or emotionally unsafe due to a history of trauma or violence. So please, if it will be unsafe for you, let me know, but otherwise, please let's everybody just hold ourselves gently this week as we think about sexual violence. One of the first things I want to talk about is how we define sexual violence. And definitions around sexual violence can vary, and there are a lot of terms that fall under sexual violence that are often confused or used interchangeably. And so, want to talk a little bit about these different aspects. The most commonly used definitions for these terms come from the National Institute of Justice, and those are included on page 602 of the reading for this week on quantifying sexual assault and rape on college campuses. And the definitions or discussions on this slide are somewhat incomplete and are more general descriptions of the different categories rather than specific definitions. So we'll start with sexual violence, which is really an umbrella term that includes things like sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape. And so when we're talking about as a broad category these things, we want to use the term sexual violence. That is the most inclusive term that we use to talk about these things. Getting more specific, we can talk about sexual harassment, which includes a range of behaviors, which may include degrading remarks, gestures, jokes, up to indecent exposure, and or someone being touched, grabbed, pinched, or brushed up against in a sexual way. And often when we think about sexual harassment, we're talking about sexual harassment in workplaces, but this is not the only place that sexual harassment occurs. One other space we often hear about sexual harassment is sort of street harassment, catcalling, and things like that. So sexual harassment really is a broad category that can include a variety of things. And that victims of sexual harassment are not always or only the folks that are being targeted by the remarks, the gestures, or the person being touched. That they also include observers and people who are in range and can witness the things that are being done as well. Moving forward, we have sexual assault, which includes a wide range of unwanted behaviors that are attempted or completed against a victim's will when the victim is unable to consent. And these behaviors include a lot of different things, up to but not including penetration, and that's a very important distinction. Also want to focus here on the idea that these sexual assault is something that can be attempted or completed. So the acts do not need to actually have fully been completed to be considered sexual assault. And then another aspect of sexual violence we want to talk about is how we quantify sexual violence. And there are often large discrepancies in statistics that we see around sexual violence or sexual assault or rape. And why is that? And especially when some of these statistics can often be even contradictory and not just different from one another. So one of the things that impacts our different statistics about sexual violence is what definitions are being used in these studies. And inconsistencies in definitions can lead to inconsistencies in reporting from agencies who are collecting the data. So for example, statistics from individual local police forces are reported to the Department of Justice. And if different local police groups are using different definitions, that can lead to inconsistency in reporting and the information that's gathered by the Department of Justice. Also, knowing that different studies or different reporting agencies will use different definitions can often make it very difficult to compare statistics, even around a specific type of sexual violence. If the definitions of that sexual violence is different, um, it can be difficult to compare statistics across studies and reports, so that's something to keep in mind. We also want to think about which types of sexual violence are being counted. And so that is, that if we have statistics that are looking at sexual assault more broadly, as opposed to only looking at rape or looking at rape and sexual assault, are going to have different iterations of numbers. Certainly, if you have a study that's only looking at rape, as opposed to a study that's looking at both rape and sexual assault, you would expect that the numbers in that second study would be much higher because you're looking at more types of sexual violence. We also want to think about whether a study is reporting only the reported instances or the experienced instances as well. And so, reported instances would be those that are specifically reported to law enforcement or perhaps a college or university that a sexual act of sexual violence had taken place, versus experienced instances, which would include all of the instances of sexual violence that had been experienced by a person or persons, including those that were not specifically reported. And so there's a well-documented gap between the reported instances of sexual violence and the total or experienced instances of sexual violence. And we know that there's a gap between that because we can look at things like criminal justice statistics that often focus specifically on reported instances and public health data or data shared with other researchers who are looking at sexual violence and talking to victims and survivors. And victims and survivors are telling us that, yes, this happened to me. No, I didn't report it. Or this happened to me multiple times and I only reported some of them. And we also know, and when we want to think about or pay attention to when we're looking at reported instances versus experienced instances, this can shift who we understand as being victims or survivors of sexual violence. And we know that 80% of rapes that are reported by white women. However, Black and Native American women experience rape at higher rates than white women. And so when we think about studies that are reporting reported instances versus experienced instances, that can change or shift some of the data that we're getting. Finally, we also want to think about who's being asked about their experiences. And certain communities experience higher rates of sexual violence, as I mentioned previously, but also looking at how the data is disaggregated when it's reported. So if there is a sample of a diverse group of people, are we only reporting the total of all of those people, or are we reporting out also smaller groups of data based on some intersectional experiences? So, for example, Native American women are twice as likely to have been raped than white women. Almost about 34% of Native American women have been sexually assaulted, or excuse me, have been raped specifically, versus 18% of white women. And both of those numbers are too high, but for Native American women, that number is much higher. But if you were to average those two together, that would potentially overreport the number of rapes experienced by white women and understate the number of rapes experienced by Native American women. We also know that transgender people and bisexual women in particular are sexually assaulted at higher rates, and those can be as high as 50% or 1 in 2 people. And so if we don't think about some of those smaller, more specific groups of people and who is being asked about their experiences, are we asking trans people as part of these studies? Are we collecting that information? May skew or lead to differences in the statistics that we see around sexual violence. Next, I want to talk about some common myths or stories, narratives that we have around rape and sexual violence more broadly, that underpin some of the social scripts or ideas that we have about what sexual assault and rape look like, supposedly, as well as who are victims or survivors and who are perpetrators of these crimes. And these myths and controlling images are often very out of sync with what statistics tell us about sexual violence, but can still be very powerful in our cultural imagination in terms of what we understand sexual violence to look like. So, one myth that is a little less common these days, but you can still find and hear, is the idea that the myth that husbands can't rape their wives, or the idea of universal consent, that entering into a marriage or a long term relationship with someone gives blanket consent, and that men, especially husbands, especially have dominion over their wives and their wives' sexuality. And while this myth is set up in a heteronormative husband wife framework, this myth also translates sometimes into same sex or LGBTQ and other relationships, and the idea that being in a relationship removes your ability to consent to sexual encounters. And again, these are myths that we're talking about and not actual facts. Another myth that we hear a lot is that women actually enjoy rape. And so this is a myth of token resistance, that they may say no initially because they need to preserve their virtue or their reputation, or they know that they're supposed to, but they actually enjoy rape and enjoy forcible sex. And this, of course, denies women autonomy and the ability to consent and decide what it is that they do or do not enjoy. And that this is a myth that is perpetuated and is sort of rooted in those sexual double standards that we talked about last week. Another myth is that women ask to be raped either by the clothing that they're wearing or the behaviors that they're engaging in, and that this myth that clothing or behavior stands in for consent. So we often hear this around, for example, women wearing short skirts. And so by wearing that short skirt, she was asking for it, or by drinking or taking drugs and reducing her cognitive abilities to, sort of function in the same way that we do when we are not drunk or high, that has removed the need to ask for consent. There's a very famous case from Italy about a judge that decided that an interaction was not rape because the woman was wearing very tight jeans. And that is a really clear example of this myth in action. And that case actually spawned a worldwide awareness/protest called Denim Day, in which folks wear denim to raise awareness around sexual assault, and specifically around this myth that women are asking to be raped by the clothing that they wear. Another myth that is still fairly prevalent is this idea that women lie about rape, or the myth of post-sex regret. The idea that women will engage in consensual sex at the time and then later regret the instance, and so relabel it and claim that it was sexual assault or rape. And that this is something that also feeds into myths around the number of false reports around rape, and that this myth that there are very high levels of false reporting, partially because of this reason of this myth of post-sex regret. And I want to just name that those last three specifically talked about women and named women as part of that myth. And we know that while women are the vast majority of folks who are subject to rape and sexual assault, sexual violence in some way, they are not the only folks. And certainly when we talk about women, we're not just talking about cisgender women, but that leads into another myth, that the idea that men can't be raped, that men are not victims of sexual assault or sexual violence. And so that also is, of course, false, although we know that men are much less likely to experience sexual violence than women are, that it still does happen, and it can be much more prominent in certain situations or certain communities. gay and bisexual men are much more likely to be sexually assaulted and raped than their heterosexual counterparts. Men who are incarcerated are much more likely to be raped than their folks who are not incarcerated. And so thinking about the situations and ways in which this also impacts who we believe, these myths impact who we believe. And so when men come forward as victims of sexual violence, they are often even less likely to be believed than women, who many of whom are already not very likely to be believed because of some of the other myths that we've spoken about. The last myth I want to talk about is the idea that rape doesn't happen in LGBT communities, which is, of course, a myth and therefore false. And this really impacts how we understand and, again, who we believe. And so folks who are in queer relationships are often less likely to be believed. But this, also interacts with some of those other myths. For example, the idea that folks in long-term relationships can't be raped. And these things interact with one another to structure and really underpin how we understand sexual violence as a culture. And so would like you to think about which, if any, of these myths have been mostly eradicated. Are there any of these that really are losing steam? And which of these myths do you see really going strong still in our current society? But also really think about how these myths influence whose reports of sexual violence we believe. Already talked a little bit about men. Being believed or less likely to be believed than women are, but also looking at other intersectional identities that are influenced. So LGBT people, folks of color, how do these myths underpin and relate to some of the other pieces that of our culture, that other structures of our culture that uphold things like patriarchy and white supremacy that interact in order to make some folks more or less believable in the wider culture. And another thing I want us to think about is how these myths are being challenged and how they have been challenged in the past by various social movements. And of course, today, the most prominent of those movements that is looking at building awareness and preventing sexual violence is the Me Too movement. And so thinking about how these social movements have led to change in public perceptions and awareness about what sexual violence is and whose responsibility it is to address it, and how those institutional responses to sexual violence are then changing or have changed, especially with our current growing negative consequences socially and often financially for not addressing sexual violence once it is brought into awareness. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about rape culture, and this is a term that was much more prominent, or at least was coming up in circles that I was in much more prominently a few years ago, but I think is still something very important to talk about in the context of sexual violence. So, rape culture is a cultural context that normalizes, excuses, tolerates, and condones things like sexual shaming, sexual assault, and rape. And in the notes for the slides and for this video, you'll see a larger quote about what rape culture is. And I just want to read a brief snippet of that, which defines rape culture as a complex set of beliefs that encourages male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. And it's a society where violence is seen as sexy and sexuality as violent. And so, really important thinking about the ways in which our culture and the ideas around gender and appropriate gender presentation encourage things like male aggression, specifically male sexual aggression, and violence against women. And so this is rape culture is a culture that links violence and sexuality in very specific ways. So violence is often seen as sexy. You can think of some of the movies or the TV shows where violent perpetrators or violence is attractive, and it's dark, and it's brooding, and it's sexually engaging, as opposed to being portrayed as negative or undesirable in some way. But also depictions that we have and perceptions around sexuality as violent. So, sex as being a violent act is something that involves power and violence in order for it to be good sex, the sort of glorification of rough sex. Thinking about, for example, 50 Shades of Grey, which is not to say that BDSM in and of itself is necessarily perpetuating rape culture, but certainly the depiction in 50 Shades of Grey that really sort of glosses over the ability of the woman whose name I can't remember to consent, and the way in which her autonomy as a human is diminished by her relationship with the man in that story. Rape culture also functions as a form of social control, which I alluded to a little bit just a second ago, in that it is part of the cultural mechanisms that work to maintain the status quo of inequality, including patriarchy and white supremacy. And so, what this often looks like is that people, especially women and folks who are sexual minorities, end up making choices or behaving in ways that restrict the full expression of their sexuality in order to reduce the chance of them being seen as quote unquote asking for it, or to reduce the probability that they will be sexually assaulted. And so, another result, or perhaps even a symptom, or to some extent a cause, a continuing cause of this, is that sexual assault prevention has largely focused on strategies that reduce specifically women's autonomy while minimizing men's responsibility for sexual assault prevention. And so, if for those of us who were raised as women or who identify currently as women, you probably are familiar with having been told to not do certain things, to not wear certain things, right? Don't wear that skirt too short, don't wear that lipstick, it's too provocative, to not go to certain places, to certain neighborhoods, to certain parties, to certain events, to not stay out too late, to not be alone, to carry certain protective items like a rape whistle or mace or something like that in order to reduce the chance that you will be sexually assaulted. And that for folks who were raised as men or who identify as men, and really anyone, we're rarely taught about what consent looks like, how to honor it, and generally how not to perpetrate sexual violence. And so the burden of sexual assault prevention has largely been on those who are more likely to be victims of sexual violence, to prevent it from happening to themselves, rather than on those who are more likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence to help them understand how not to be perpetrators. And these, of course, are linked to normative ideas of masculinity and femininity, to sexual double standards that we talked about last week, and to gendered ideas about what appropriate sexuality looks like for different people. So that's all for this week. I hope you find the readings for this week interesting and help you untangle and engage some of the complicated pieces around sexual violence and consent, and have a great rest of your week.